Planet Earth. So this is the final series in the Planet Earth franchise that I have not yet reviewed, so I figured it was time that I did that. So this is without a doubt the most famous series to have come out of the BBC Natural History Unit. This series basically changed the game with regards to what natural filmmaking was. Before this series, programmes were more education oriented. You basically saw an animal, they talked about them, you'd maybe see a presenter with them as well. And it would be interesting, there would be some sort of narrative to the series. Every episode would be based around a specific theme, and the series would follow a natural progression of those themes, leading to some form of conclusion. This series went to hell with that. It takes a collection of seemingly unconnected sequences based around a vague theme, in this case a habitat that they feature in, and basically throws them together, and what you get is a hodgepodge of interesting sequences featuring a variety of different animals. And the fact that this series was filmed in HD and is basically driven by the spectacle of those sequences is basically the formula that all series after this followed. I think there are only a handful of series I think that have changed the game with regards to these kind of programmes, and Planet Earth is absolutely one of them. So, Planet Earth, why is it so beloved? Well, we'll get into that as the reviews progress. As I get further into the series, I'll kind of touch on why it's so beloved. So the first episode of this series is called Pole to Pole. It's basically an intro episode. You see a lot of sequences in here that feature in later episodes, so I won't touch on them too heavily if they feature more heavily in a later episode. But this episode does a great job of just setting the scene. It just basically takes you, shows you what the series is about, and I think that's great. So in this episode being called Pole to Pole, we basically travel from one pole to another and then back again. And in that, we start out in Antarctica in the winter, where we see emperor penguins. So this sequence is famous. I mean, it's been done so many times, kind of around this time and since. We've seen it in Planet Earth, we've seen it in March of the Penguins, we've seen it in Frozen Planet, we've seen it in Happy Feet. I mean, we've seen penguins, specifically male emperor penguins, huddled together during the bitter Antarctic cold and just surviving while they keep their eggs warm. It's a very simple task they have to do, and it's great. I think it does a really good job of setting the tone for this series. This series isn't really like most modern series where everything's a little bit fluffier, everything's a bit, you know, there's kind of a happy ending to most stories, and everything's kind of, all the animals are kind of having a fun time for the most part, unless we've intervened. This series basically shows you how animals live their lives, and it's not always nice, it's not always a nice happy ending we get. There's a lot of bleak stuff in here, there's a lot of violent stuff in here. It's quite honest. I feel like it's a very honest portrayal of the natural world. And from there we move on to the far north, where we see polar bears. This is a bit more wholesome. We see some polar bear cubs emerging from the den with their mother, and they're playing in the snow. The mum's playing in the snow. Amber even says, oh, maybe she's just doing it for the sheer joy. It's a great sequence. It goes on for quite a while. We do see the polar bears just kind of get further and further away from their den, and it does a good job of highlighting how serious the situation is. The sea ice is melting, we keep hearing about that, but the cubs are playing, you know, the mum is kind of playing with them as well, and as it goes on, the mum kind of looks to the sea a lot, and it's kind of like showing you how, you know, she's aware that the time to catch the seals that they need to survive is running out, and these cubs need to get their act together and head down to the ice. It's a really good job. It's quite a good job of showing you how, you know, there is some nice things in nature, you know, animals play, but ultimately they do need to survive, and that is what this sequence highlights, I think. So from there we start heading south. The next place we hit is the tundra. So in the tundra we see the caribou migration, which is the largest overland migration by any animal we've seen. And in here we see something this series really uses to its full advantage, particularly in this episode, and that is helicopters. So this is before drones were a thing. Drones are pretty common now, you see them a lot, especially since Seven Worlds, One Planet, but this series used helicopters with cameras attached. Like the caribou migration is hard to really put into a picture how like massive it is, and I think this episode did a good job of that. And in that we also see wolves hunting caribou. So we saw in Planet Earth 2, as I described in my last series reviews, that there is a sequence where wolves hunted the caribou calf, and the caribou calf gets away. And it's a nice win for the caribou because we didn't see it in Planet Earth. So in Planet Earth, the hunt sequence is a lot more impressive. It is a really good sequence. You see the caribou calf being chased by these wolves over quite a fair distance, and it goes on for quite a while, and you do kind of feel like the odds are kind of in no one's favour. Like the wolves could catch the caribou, but the caribou also might get away. Like it's very touch and go a few times. Ultimately the wolves do get the caribou calf, and it's, again, it feels like you've been there. You feel like you've witnessed this caribou struggle to survive, but also the wolves struggle to catch it. So depending on whose side you're on, realistically the caribou it's an interesting sequence. So it does appear later in another episode of this series, which is something I will say this series kind of does. It's a little bit of a flaw here, and a few series after it did this as well. Life did it, Frozen Planet did it as well to a lesser extent. But it was basically having the first episode having all these great sequences, but then some of them would pop up later on, so you kind of felt like you were watching it twice because you were. Now usually they'd add bits to it or take bits away, but it still felt a little bit repetitive. Then we start moving further south, we move onto the forests, we see the taiga, and this episode does a good job. It's not just showing you animals, it's very much about planet Earth. It's not just the animals that live on planet Earth. We talk about the weather systems, we talk about habitats, how these habitats function in accordance with the weather. It's a very good job, it does a good job of showing you all that. And we do spend a bit of time with Amur leopards in the eastern Russian forests, and it's great. I mean, you don't see them very often. They do a good job of telling you how endangered they are. There was only 40 at the time. I don't think that's the same anymore. I feel like there must be more. I mean, this 2006, I mean, we're almost 20 years later, so you'd think some conservation efforts would have been made to boost those numbers up a bit. But it's a nice sequence. The next habitat we really look at is the jungles, and then we see a lot of birds of paradise. We see a lot of them just, you know, the usual. I've said this before about birds of paradise, you know, I feel like I've seen them a lot because we have, but it's always something nice about seeing what they're doing, because they're always going to be doing some sort of display, but you don't really know what the display is. And in here you just see a couple of them. You see, especially the one, I can't remember the name of it, it's maybe the Marvellous or the Spectacular Birds of Paradise. I mean, they all have names like that. And it's basically just jumping around. It's got the very iridescent blue around its feathers with the little dots look like eyes. It's quite cool, and it doesn't actually get the female, which is kind of funny. There's not a lot of funny sequences in here. I would say a lot of later series have an attempt to have a bit of humour in there. A Planet Earth 2 had quite a bit. In this series there's not a lot. It definitely focuses more on the severity of life on planet Earth, which I think is good, because ultimately, you know, there is more serious stuff in nature than there is funny stuff. From there we move from the land to the oceans, where we talk about how ocean currents impact things. We see life in the ocean, and then we see the Cape fur seals being hunted by great white sharks. Now this is a sequence that I will talk more heavily about in a later video, because there is a lot more depth in that episode. But here we basically just see the great white sharks catching the fur seals, and it's probably one of the more iconic sequences from this series. It's amazing, and yeah, I will say no more about that. From there we move on to talk about weather. We talk about how weather systems form, and we talk about the Okavango Delta. So we see all these animals moving towards the Okavango. We see buffalo, we see zebra, we see elephants. We spend a bit more time with the elephants. We see these elephants caught in a dust storm, and it's quite good. You get the sense that the elephants are lost, they have to find each other again. It's quite good. There is one really harrowing bit though at the end, when it talks about this one sort of young elephant that's following its mother's footsteps in the wrong direction, so it's realistically just going to wander back into the desert and it's going to die. The series goes there. It doesn't shy away from the kind of harsh realities of life. And then we see the Okavango Delta in all its glory. The highlight is the African wild dogs though. This episode, I would say, is not an exciting episode necessarily. It's a lot of showing you things. Kind of harkens back to what a lot of series were before they were more spectacle driven. This is kind of more in line with what your average wildlife documentary was like before the series came out. Probably the biggest spectacle in this episode is the wild dog hunt. It's great. Again, the fact that they filmed it from the helicopters, they were really able to get a proper good look at how these hunts happen. So we've seen a lot of wild dog hunts, and to be fair, a lot of them are filmed probably better than this one. But something about it just great. You felt like they were pioneering to get these shots, and you probably see them running through the bushes, trying to catch these impala. The impala gets into the water, and these another part of the pack managed to kill one, which we don't see. I think it's a really good high octane chase scene, and I really like it. Yeah, it's a really good sequence. At the end of that sequence, we see the elephants get into the waterhole finally, and they're playing in the water, they're frolicking. It's all nice, and we finish the episode back in Antarctica where we started. We've come full circle from pole to pole, back to the first pole, and where we see the emperor penguin chicks hatch, and it's a nice sequence. Again, it's good. The sun's come up, the males are out in the winter, and they've got their chicks, and it's all like everything was worth it in the end. Again, despite the fact that I've gone on about how this series and this episode does a good job of showing you the harsh realities of nature, sometimes animals get a win, and the desire to get that win is what life is ultimately all about, and I think that is a great way to end this episode. And then after that we see the making of sequence, and it's all about the guys that filmed the wild dogs, and then the Okavango Delta, but mostly the wild dogs. There's a lot of work went in. There was a lot of guys in the helicopters, there were a lot of guys in the ground, there were tents on fire, it was pandemonium. but they managed to get the shots, and it felt really good. Again, the music was quite weird. The music was quite like, it felt like an 80s like, I don't know, like Magnum PI or something. It was kind of fun. Also, another thing to note is these series didn't have making of sequences before Planet Earth. This was the first series where that was a thing, and that's because all these programs generally were 50 minutes long. That's fine for British television and BBC. You could just have a 50-minute slot, but when these programs went to America, there was always that room for ad breaks, so it had to be an hour. So in order to fill that time, they had to add a little bit more in. So a lot of series before this, they didn't really know what to do with it. They kind of had a kind of something similar to a making of sequence. They would kind of just, sometimes they would just interview people that had something vaguely to do with the series they were filming. It was kind of, I felt a bit disjointed a lot of the time. In this series, they basically went, right, why don't we just show you what the cameramen are up to? Because they're ultimately the real heroes of these stories. They're the guys going on the ground filming it. Why don't we give them their limelight? And I think that was a really smart move, because a lot of the time these sequences are sometimes some of the best parts of the episodes. And I think it gave a lot of cameramen a bit of time to shine. There's a lot more people you'd recognise from a lot of these sequences. You're like, oh, that guy was in that series, he filmed that part, or oh, he filmed this part in this other series. You kind of see them, and it kind of gives them a bit more personality, and it gives them a bit more, I think a little bit more credit, I think, in the eyes of the audience. So that's always good. So overall, this episode is good. I think it's a good way to start the series. Again, as I've said, it's a good job of setting you up to the tone of the series. It does a good job of just showing you the kind of things you're going to see. Some of it you will see again. While it isn't maybe as exciting as some of the other episodes in this series, it is a good starting point for the series, and it's really good. So next week I will be doing the Mountains episode, which is the first of the specific, like, focused on a different habitat episodes. So yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment and subscribe if you like this, and also as ever, feel free, because you don't need to. Don't worry, this isn't you have to do anything. I'm not going to guilt trip you, but feel free, or don't. It's entirely up to you. And yeah, as I said, I'll be doing the next one next week, and see you then, and goodbye.